Bob Barker, a man who distributed millions in prize money, concluded each broadcast with the same gentle reminder and became one of the most beloved figures in American living rooms, appeared to shift subtly during his later years. The tales he started telling no longer matched the persona that fans thought they understood. He gave cryptic references to the women operating behind the scenes, cautioned about what genuinely happened inside that studio, and offered quiet meditations that astonished even his inner circle. Now, years following his passing, a fresh documentary series is pulling those final statements back into the spotlight, showing that what Barker expressed at the end was not what anyone had expected. Bob Barker's journey did not start under television lights, but rather far from Los Angeles, in a rough and silent environment that most people never associate with his name. He entered the world on December 12, 1923, in Darrington, Washington. While he was still quite young, though, everything shifted. His father, Byron John Barker, worked as an electrical power foreman, scaling dangerous utility poles to help electrify distant areas. It was hazardous labor, and in 1929, that danger became deadly. Byron fell from a tall pole and succumbed to his injuries, breaking the family almost instantly. Bob was merely 5 years old. His secure childhood disappeared, and his mother, Matilda, was forced to bear the entire burden of survival alone. That tragedy pushed the family into poverty during one of America's toughest periods. No real support systems awaited them, nor any simple path ahead. Matilda struggled as a single parent, trying to keep things together until her brother-in-law assisted her in getting a teaching position on the Rosebud Indian Reservation in South Dakota. Thus, at age 6, Bob was brought into a life that bore no resemblance to the one he might have known. It was isolated, tough, and deeply influenced by suffering. Still, it was also the place that molded him. What makes this segment of his story even more remarkable is that Bob Barker was not just residing on the reservation. He also had ancestral connections there. Since his father had 1/4 Sioux blood, Bob was 1/8 Lakota, and the Rosebud Sioux tribe publicly acknowledged him as an enrolled member in the U.S. Indian Census records. That fact alters how people view him. He was not simply a famous TV host who had once spent time on a reservation. Those roots were part of who he was, even if most people never realized it. His upbringing there was neither gentle nor simple. He went to the reservation's elementary school, where his mother taught. The environment around them was defined by Dust Bowl storms that packed the air with soil, buried houses, and destroyed livestock. Families dealt with overwhelming loneliness. There were no proper roads, no electricity, and very little comfort. Government rations were frequently inadequate. Children played in teepees, but this was not some romantic image from a history textbook. It was a difficult existence where survival came first. Even so, those years gave him something enduring. The discipline that audiences later noticed on television did not emerge by chance. It was honed in a setting where life was demanding every single day. Much later, Barker proudly declared, "The Sioux were the greatest warriors," and that pride clearly remained with him. At the core of that early life stood his mother, Matilda Tarleton Barker, a woman who was much more than a teacher. She was strong, educated, and resolute, and she rose to become Todd County Superintendent. In that capacity, she was not merely instructing children in a forgotten corner of South Dakota. She was influencing how they learned and how they understood the world around them. She even wrote a complete South Dakota history textbook titled Our State, issued in 1930 and reprinted in 1941, which was used by 6th graders across the state. That is an extraordinary detail on its own. Here was a woman teaching on Lakota land, composing official narratives about the state, and holding genuine authority in a place filled with conflict, memory, and difficulty, long after the shadow of Wounded Knee still loomed over the region. At home, that same force shaped Bob. She was strict, disciplined, and deeply serious about education and conduct. He observed her managing classrooms that lacked basic supplies while still demanding order and effort. So when people later saw Bob Barker as sophisticated, composed, and always in command, they were also seeing the impact of a mother who believed in standards and enforced them. Within a week of arriving in Los Angeles, producer Ralph Edwards heard Bob on the radio while driving in his car. What he heard was sufficient. Barker's voice, rhythm, and effortless charm stood out so vividly that Edward selected him to replace Jack Bailey on Truth or Consequences. No extended struggle, no dramatic years of being overlooked. Just one moment where the right person heard the right voice at the right time. Before television fully claimed him, he also gained momentum on radio with The Bob Barker Show, which aired from 1950 to 1956. That gave him a base. But the real breakthrough came when he stepped into television. In 1956, Bob Barker became the host of Truth or Consequences on NBC, and that program turned him into a star. The format was odd, rapid, and humorous. Contestants had only 1 second to answer a question correctly. And if they failed, they faced some ridiculous penalty. It could be embarrassing, messy, or physically absurd. But that was part of the fun. Barker was ideal for it because he could navigate chaos without losing his composure. He could laugh with people, not at them. And that made all the difference. What followed was incredible. He hosted 3,524 consecutive episodes over 18 years. That kind of run is hard to even imagine today. It was not merely long, it was relentless. He became such a staple that Guinness recognized him as television's most durable performer. The title sounds dramatic, but in his case, it fit. While many hosts fade after one era, Barker kept going. Then another facet of him became visible in a very public manner. From 1966 to 1987, Barker hosted both the Miss USA and Miss Universe pageants. For years, he stood on stage amid all that beauty, glamour, and sparkle. But beneath that polished surface, a conflict was growing inside him. Barker had become increasingly dedicated to animal rights, and the pageants kept giving away real fur coats as prizes. That troubled him deeply. It conflicted with everything he was starting to believe and publicly support. In 1987, he warned organizers that he would leave if they forced contestants to wear real fur on stage. They made partial adjustments for the cameras, but still awarded real fur as prizes. Then, when real fur was scheduled to return in 1988, Barker refused to go back. He walked away for good. That decision mattered because it showed that his public compassion for animals was not just a slogan he would use later. He was willing to quit a major job over it. By then, another huge shift had already occurred in his career. In 1972, Barker became the host of The Price is Right. At that point, the show already existed in an earlier form, but it was hardly a cultural phenomenon. In many ways, it looked like an old concept being given one more chance. Then Barker stepped in and altered everything. Under his leadership, the show became louder, quicker, and far more thrilling. There were pricing games, enormous prizes, ringing bells, and that unforgettable sensation that an ordinary person's life might suddenly change in front of millions of viewers. What made it work was not just the format, it was Barker himself. He had a smooth, playful way of speaking to strangers that made the whole experience feel warm instead of robotic. A blender, a car, or a vacation did not sound like just another prize when he was guiding the moment. He could stretch tension until a few seconds felt monumental. He could make contestants feel acknowledged. He could calm people down when they were trembling and laugh with them when they became wild. He turned a simple pricing game into a daily ritual that families watched together for decades. That is what made The Price is Right more than a successful show. It became part of American life. On paper, the idea seems so plain. People guess prices. They win household items, cars, trips, and cash. But Barker understood something deeper. Ordinary people do not just want prizes. They want possibility. They want to believe that one lucky moment could pull them into a new life. He gave that feeling shape. He made the audience at home feel that the next person called down could be anyone. That is why his style mattered so much. He was not distant. He made the show feel close. Inside the studio, the feeling was both joyful and painful. Barker stayed composed, but the people around him were visibly struggling with the moment. His final goodbye was incredibly short. He thanked viewers for inviting him into their homes for 50 years, repeated his message about spaying and neutering pets, and said goodbye. That was it. No long speech, no dramatic farewell, just a few simple lines. And somehow that made it hit even harder. After thousands of episodes, he stepped away with restraint instead of spectacle. The quietness of it made it feel final. Afterward, CBS honored him by renaming the space the Bob Barker Studio, a tribute to the years he had spent there. For decades, that studio had been tied to his presence, his voice, and the rhythm of the show itself. But even that chapter eventually closed. In 2023, major renovations forced The Price is Right to leave its longtime home, which felt symbolic to many fans. Television moves on. Buildings change. Even places that seem permanent disappear. But Barker's presence still seemed to live in the memory of that space. Then in August 2023, the final chapter arrived. Bob Barker died peacefully at his Hollywood Hills home on August 26th, just a few months short of his 100th birthday. He had been dealing privately with Alzheimer's disease, along with health issues that included skin cancer and injuries from falls. Even near the end, people close to him said he could still talk and exercise at times, which made his decline less visible to the public. In death, just as in life, he kept things controlled and simple. He did not want a funeral or a public memorial. Instead, he requested a quiet burial beside his wife, Dorothy Jo, the woman who had shaped so much of his personal life and moral direction. When his bronze headstone was finally placed in September 2024 at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in the Hollywood Hills, it was simple, too. It read only, Robert W. Barker, 1923 to 2023. No flourish, no speech, no grand final performance. That restraint matched the way he chose to leave the world. In one of his final recorded reflections, Barker said he hoped people would remember him as a man who loved all living things and tried to make the world better for animals, while also doing a lot of television shows. That line says a great deal about how he saw himself, not first as a celebrity, not first as a television giant, but as someone who cared deeply about suffering and wanted to use his fame for something that mattered. It also explains why animal rights advocates praised him so strongly after his death. To them, he was not just a donor. He was one of the rare public figures who took a fringe issue and made it mainstream. He talked about it constantly, gave serious money to it, and kept fighting for it long after most stars would have moved on. That work did not end with him. The DJ&T Foundation continued operating after his death, supporting clinics and programs that made spay and neuter services more accessible across the country. In that sense, his most repeated line did more than become a catchphrase. It became a mission that kept going after he was gone. And still, even after his death, the arguments around his legacy did not fade. The 2026 docuseries Dirty Rotten Scandals, The Price is Right reopened the painful questions about what kind of man Barker really was behind the scenes. Former models described a workplace full of harassment, creepy behavior, and complaints that were brushed aside. Some defended him. Others painted a deeply ugly picture. That clash is now part of his story, too. He could be a passionate animal advocate and also a man accused of causing real harm to the women around him. He could be generous, disciplined, and influential, while also leaving behind stories that are hard to hear and impossible to ignore.